Yes, ma'am. You had your hand up.
I was wondering how...
If you could identify yourself, too,
Oh,
please.
I'm sorry. I'm Amanda Carroll. I'm registering for a prayer. And I was wondering how illegal aliens access, like, welfare provisions and such as that. Like, according to the statute, you have to be a legal immigrant or naturalized citizen or whatnot to access the program. And I understand if you have an American citizen child, but by statute, then you would only get allotted for an amount for the citizen child. So then how is the argument coming about that illegal aliens are accessing welfare programs?
Well, it depends on how you look at that, right? There are a few cases of fraud. There would be the case of a person who needs emergency medical care, particularly during a pregnancy, can be enrolled in Medicaid. So there are a couple of exceptions, but mainly we're looking at households. So the household head is illegal, and typically they have a spouse who is also illegal, but they have U.S.-born children, and the children are enrolled in free school lunch. The children are enrolled in Medicaid. And the parents, if they have, say, a young child, are enrolled in WIC. So that would be an example. Now, there are cases, and we have a few of them identifiable actually in the data, where you have a child who was born in the United States who's considered disabled and is getting SSI. And you have cases where, and it's considered a child-only account. Or you have cases where people receive TANF, but not the parents. It's essentially for the children. There's not a huge number of those, and that's why the cash assistance shows low. But there's a very large fraction of illegal immigrants who've signed their kids up for free school lunch, who've signed their kids up for Medicaid, who've signed their kids up for WIC. There's also some who get food stamps. California in particular, and you can see it in the data and you hear about it all the time, has a real fraud problem in its food stamps program. So there it does look like illegal immigrants have really penetrated that program. But generally that's not the case. Generally that's not what's happening.
So the amount then would be proportional. You would include the number as a household in your study, even though it would just be like an amount allotted to one.
Or not necessarily a lot, but just enrollment, right? Or in Medicaid, say. Yes, no, and let me make that clear. The estimates, and then when you break it down by each individual program, are based on the characteristics of the household head, whether we think the person is legal or illegal, and then the share who have someone in that household. And for the illegals, it's typically, though not always, a U.S.-born child enrolled in these programs, and then we have them laid out.
Right. For TANF, the share that goes to the children is the vast bulk of the welfare benefits. The share that the parents would be disqualified for is like 20%. It's not.
Yeah, it's real small.
The bulk would go to the children, but as this data shows, that illegal immigrants don't sign up for much of.
In a few
TANF
places that seems to happen, and I'm not sure if it's a statistical quirk or what, there are people who would be, the parent is disqualified, but the children get it, and they show up in the data. And the methodology we use to distinguish illegal from legal just allows for that, and we find those people, but it's not huge. The big stuff is the food assistance and the Medicaid for the illegals. For the legal immigrants, it's everything, especially the unskilled legal immigrants. In one of the tables, this is really the toughest challenge for, I think, a person who makes the case that unskilled legal immigration is a good idea. On page 17, we look at households that are not from refugee sending countries, and this is table 6, where the household head has no more than a high school degree. So either the household head didn't graduate high school or has only a high school degree. And pretty much across the board, you've got pretty darn high use rates. Now remember, for the cash, it shows 11%. The actual rate is higher, as I indicated at the outset, because people understate their use. But even the use of housing assistance is much higher than the native born, or somewhat higher, and so forth. Those individuals, that is that is, I think, really one of the biggest questions. Could you change that somehow by reforming the welfare system? It seems unlikely to me. Ian feels that you could change that and not have these folks accessing so many programs at high rates. I'm very skeptical.
If I could just say one thing to argue with Ian. It seems to me that in '96 we decided we wanted to shift, and we did it very imperfectly and in a halfway sort of way. We wanted to shift from a society that gave welfare benefits to fight poverty, so all you had to do was be poor, to a society that wanted to give benefits to the working poor. In other words, if you worked in our society, we didn't want you to be poor, and so we would, if you worked, you would get all these benefits ladled on top of your wage. And because the income spectrum has been stretched and unskilled work doesn't pay that much, it turns out that it's a fairly substantial subsidy if you add up the EITC and all the other benefits available to the working poor. I don't think we're going to change that. I think we've decided if you work in this society at a minimum wage, you should be able to live a life of dignity, and we're going to give you the EITC and WIC and all the medical care on top of your wage. So I don't think you can, and if immigrants come in and they get those things, it's going to be a substantial expense. I don't think you're going to get rid of the welfare part, because welfare by and large is now, there are exceptions like food stamps directed to working poor people.
Well, I think here is where we can actually learn from what's going on in the United Kingdom at the moment, where the tastefully named Ian Duncan Smith, who is the Work and Pensions Secretary over there, identified that British welfare had created a working poor poverty trap. That the sheer number and variety of benefits that people were the people were obtaining were basically keeping people earning very small amounts of money and stopping them from certainly from becoming entrepreneurs and also from accepting promotions and so on. So he is moving towards a system which sweeps away this vast number of welfare programs in the UK and replacing them with a single universal credit, which is to be designed such that that earning more money does not make you poorer. And that, I think, is the problem that we've got in the States at the moment. And that's, so I think we need to look at what the UK is doing there to think about whether we should be enacting a similar welfare reform, which would indeed be on the of the scale of what happened in the 90s.
I had kind of a question, I guess directed sort of to Mickey. And, I mean, you would acknowledge that welfare, cash or non-cash, is at least a necessary evil. In other words, it'd be better if nobody had to collect welfare, right?
Right.
In other words, so is there any rationale for an immigration policy that admits anyone who is likely to use welfare? In other words, isn't the admission of any foreign-born person who is going to use welfare at any rate, even if it were lower than that of the native-born, isn't that, in a sense, a kind of failure of policy? In other words, not so much a moral failure, because, I mean, I think we all agree on this issue that, you know, my grandma from Sicily didn't use welfare, these guys today are somehow, you know, worse, that's silly. But isn't it a failure of policy to have any immigrants on welfare?
Well, is it a failure of policy if you let in an immigrant and they work very hard at a low-wage job and as a result they qualify for the earned income tax
that's my
credit and
question,
various things? And I would say if that was the only effect, we wouldn't be worried about immigration. Clearly, on the other side, it's good for the immigrant to come to America.
Sure.
Clearly, there are employers who like having that immigrant labor. So, and yes, it costs something if they qualify for the EITC, but if that were the only negative aspect of immigration, we wouldn't be opposing immigration. We're opposing uncontrolled immigration. We oppose it because it drives down the wages of the native-born, and it's threatening to create an inegalitarian society on the order of Rio de Janeiro in parts of Southern California, and it's also challenging our national culture and national sovereignty. Those are the big issues. This is an issue that the expense of welfare is something that's very salient now because we're in the middle of a big budget crisis, but by itself, I don't think it'd be enough to worry that much about immigration.
But as Steve pointed out, it's not really just the expense, it's also welfare use as a kind of yardstick for some of the things you're actually talking about. In other words, if we're turning into a Brazil kind of society with huge gaps between rich and poor, high welfare use is sort of one of the canaries in the coal mine that points in that direction. Do you see what I mean? In other words, it's not just the money, it seems to me, it's that this is an indicator, a symptom of a failed immigration policy, which has all kinds of other effects too.
It's a symptom of a failed immigration policy, but I agree with that, but, I mean, I guess, you know, if we have a minimum wage and people get the earned income tax credit, it seems to me we don't become Brazil. We become Brazil if you know, immigrants pour in and they're working under the table and the people, you know, people who would ordinarily be working for the minimum wage, Americans can't find work at all and then end up on welfare. That's the problem to me.
Anyone else? We can take one last question, I think, before we break up. No? So, I think, I'm not sure about everybody's schedule, but I'm pretty sure Steve is willing to be accosted afterwards, if you have, anything you want to say. So, for those of you who didn't get the report, it's back there on the table outside. It's a folder with the report and contact information. This and all of the rest of our work is online at cis.org, and I'd like to thank Mickey and Ian for coming out for this. And thanks to all of you, and see you at our next event.